Abby has been one of the more interesting characters in this entire show ever since we first saw her way back in Boyd's backstory. And in season 2, we ended up getting multiple scenes where she interacted with Boyd. And these scenes definitely leave you asking a lot of questions and wondering whether or not this was actually the real Abby trying to save Boyd, or if it was actually a secret demon entity using her face in order to deceive Boyd and get him to take actions that would lead to the downfall of the people of this town. And this is something that we really need to answer because it's very important for us to understand whether or not the Abby that Boyd sees is on our side or not. The first thing that immediately comes to mind about Abby is when Boyd and Sarah had decided to go on their journey of finding answers, or ideally finding a way out. They ended up finding the bottle tree, and Sarah has a massive seizure and she ends up passing out because of it. While they were in the tent camping for the night, Sarah tells Boyd that the voices had spoken to her once again when they were at the bottle tree. Sarah said she had a woman voice for the first time and that the voice said, "Tell Mr. Fish and Loaves I was wrong."
The voice I heard, it was different this time. It was a woman, and she was screaming. She kept saying, "Tell Mr. Fish and Loaves that I was wrong."
Abby and Ellis are the only two people who knew that Boyd had this nickname when he was in the military. And considering Ellis was back in the town and she said specifically that it was a woman, this voice is clearly implied to have been Iron Abby. Basically, the writers are telling us that Abby had spoken to Boyd from beyond the grave using Sarah as a conduit. And she had given them a warning, saying that she was wrong about telling Boyd to go out into the woods and go looking for answers. And this is a callback to when Boyd was in the diner after Sarah tried to kill Ethan. Boyd had asked for a sign about whether this mission was a good idea. So when he had the jukebox playing his and Abby's song, he knew that she was telling him looking for answers was the right move. If this voice really was Abby, then perhaps she was trying to protect them from getting infected with the worms or whatever it was that dragged the tent all over the forest while Boyd and Sarah were inside. But this was back in the first season, and it's by far the least mysterious thing related to Abby, because in season 2 episode 9, something that's way more freaky happened when Boyd went to the RV after Randall had kidnapped Donna and tied her to a tree, because later that night they were surrounded by the monsters and Abby ended up showing up and she only said one line, but to this day it's one of the most powerful lines in the entire show.
"Boyd, come back to me."
This scene right here remains one of the craziest things we've ever seen, because what did she mean when she said "come back to me"? What was banging underneath the RV before Abby showed up? And of course, the most important one of all, was that really Abby at all? What I think we should pay attention to in this scene is how the monsters completely stopped their advancement to the RV when Abby had showed up. There's many ways that you could look at them making that action. Could be that Abby has a way of neutralizing the monsters from wherever she went after she died, and therefore she was actually buying them time so that they could escape, but that power is very limited, which is why she ended up disappearing so quickly. Or with the music box playing before she showed up, maybe she was able to use it to conjure herself in order to help Boyd at that moment. But perhaps the most important scene with Abby is when Boyd goes back to the dungeon to destroy the music box and free everyone who'd been infected by the cicadas. Once again, Abby showed herself while they were in the dungeon, and this was a very interesting moment because for me, Abby was the last thing I expected to show up in this moment. She also says something that might be a clue as to what's going on in the town, and whatever the big big bad of the show is actually trying to do with the humans. Abby tells Boyd while they're in the dungeon that he should stop fighting because he's doing what the entity desires. She says that the entity wants them to keep having hope and keep up fighting the good fight, because so long as they have hope, they'll just keep suffering, which is what the entity wants from them.
It wants you to fight. It wants you to have hope that you could actually win.
Why?
This hope is what makes you willing to suffer. It's not your fear that feeds the forest boy. It's hope.
So by this point, and looking back on all the Abby scenes that we've had by the end of season 2, you can definitely come to the conclusion that she's just trying to help the townspeople and that it was actually her when she was appearing to Boyd. But once you remember that the entity's goal is clearly to prevent the people from exploring Fromland and finding answers, you start thinking about these moments in a very different light. For example, at the bottle tree, Sarah had a seizure while Boyd was reaching for one of the bottles. And the only reason Boyd didn't get the other bottles and therefore be able to read the contents of the bottles was because he had to take care of Sarah after the seizure. So maybe the entity somehow caused the seizure in Sarah. And at the RV, when Abby showed up, the music box was playing right before it happened, and the way the monsters recognized her and stopped in their tracks can easily be seen as them showing respect for their boss. It can easily be seen as them showing fear for the demon that commands them. And at the end of the season, when Boyd went back into the dungeon, the things that Abby said in this moment were very, very weird and definitely very, very curious, because for everything that she kept saying and all of the word salad that she was tossing at Boyd, it was clear that the intention throughout the entire interaction was to prevent Boyd from destroying the music box and therefore prevent him from freeing the people that were trapped in the dungeon at that point. And it's very obvious that it was trying to manipulate him by using his love for Abby as the tool for doing so.
You think you need to be responsible to save them. You don't have to suffer anymore. It's okay. None of this matters. We can be together.
Katri's appearances throughout the second season also really hammer in this point of the entity using apparitions of people Boyd is close to in order to manipulate him into stopping his search for answers about what is going on in Fromland and what the town actually is. Like, after exiting the dungeon, we eventually get this scene of Father Katri at Boyd's office, and this scene to me has always been something that greatly stood out to me as an amazing sign of the manipulation that Boyd is being put through by the entity. In this scene, Father Katri tells Boyd not to tell Kenny that Sarah is the reason his dad ended up dying the way that he did. Boyd doesn't agree with him and decides to tell Kenny anyways, and what's funny about this is afterwards it was Tilly who informed Boyd that Kenny already knew because Sarah told him, and of course Tilly is someone many of us in the From community already suspect. But the last time we got to see Father Katri is what really seals the deal, that all the times we've seen Abby after her death were nothing more than a ploy by the demon to try to manipulate Boyd, that all these moments weren't anything more than an attempt to make him stop looking for answers, attempts to get him to give up and accept his death. In this scene that takes place at the clinic, Katri is trying to convince Boyd that everything he's done so far is enough, that he's tried his best time and time again, and failure is the outcome of his efforts. He basically tells Boyd that it's over and it's time for him to throw in the towel, but what he says next is really what shows that it was never Katri nor Abby trying to talk to Boyd, but the entity himself.
Sheriff, I knew, would have never asked for help. You were the most stubborn asshole I have ever met. You did what you could, boy. Not every story gets a happy ending. Mine didn't. Abby's didn't.
You are still the worst fucking priest I've ever met.
So maybe imagine a better version next time.
This to me was a slip up by the entity because he messed up by claiming to be a part of Boyd's imagination, even though there's clearly a lot more going on than that. He also said Boyd was the most stubborn man he's ever met, basically saying that no matter how many times he tries to break Boyd and get him to roll over and let Fromland win, Boyd always refuses and chooses to get back up and keep looking for a way out of Fromland, which is why he considers Boyd to be the most stubborn man he's ever met. How many people do you know who could kill someone they've loved for decades and still be able to say,
You don't fucking break me!
But like every man, the entity knows that he has one weakness: the people that he loves. This is why it chooses to use Abby, and the fact that he himself killed her makes Abby that much more powerful against him. Something I want to remind you is the voice at the bottle tree told Sarah that it's dangerous for them to keep going on their journey because there are much worse monsters hiding in the forest than the creatures that come out in the town. This line was the same exact thing that Martin the old man said to Boyd when he first entered the dungeon. This might be another slip up by the entity, just like when it tried to make Boyd believe that it was just a figment of his imagination. The reality of Martin has always been in question from the beginning since his introduction, and there's a lot about him that makes it seem like he was some sort of trap made by the entity to infect Boyd with the worms and the music box. This would also explain why the entity was right there at the end of the season using Abby to try to stop Boyd from destroying the music box, because it's very obvious that it needed the ritual of using worms to kill Smiley to be performed for him to trap those people in the dungeon. Basically, what I'm saying is when we take a look at Abby's scenes throughout the show after her death, it's obvious that the demon entity is using her form specifically to manipulate Boyd. And the reason it's chosen to use Abby so much in particular is because it understands that she is a weakness for Boyd. She is the woman he loved for decades, and he's the one who had to put her down, and it understands Boyd will never truly get over that entire situation. That is why it loves to use Abby to try to convince Boyd into doing these things, into making mistakes. So I'm definitely of the opinion that the apparitions we were seeing were not Abby herself, but were actually the entity in disguise trying to manipulate Boyd. And when it comes to the manipulation in Fromland by these seemingly supernatural beings, there's a lot of it going around, and Sarah in particular has been a very popular choice for these demons to the point where she almost killed Ethan because of it. But why did the voices ask her to do that? Were the voices really trying to help the townspeople, or were they trying to hurt them all along? Watch my video about why the voices told Sarah to kill the boy, because getting an answer to that question is obviously very important to us understanding what's actually going on in Fromland.